9. We have Dr. John on the phone from Creation Ministries International. Good morning, Dr. John.
Yeah, good morning, Mick. How are you today?
Oh, very good. It's great to have you back again this morning, Dr. John. We've got a few questions that have come in over the last couple of weeks, one that we'll probably hold over till next week. And, of course, Creation Ministries International do have a website, creation.com, where you can get all sorts of questions answered on all sorts of things to do with creation, evolution, dinosaurs, aliens, all sorts of things. But, of course, this morning is a time where you get to ask questions of Dr. John by sending them through to our text line, just SMS 0401 949 949. Now, a question that came in just after last week's session, Dr. John. It was an interesting one, and the question was, Dr. John, there's 3 options for the beginning of the universe. 1, the planets and stars were always there. Why is this not possible? Then number 2, there was a big bang where everything came from nothing. Why is this not possible? And I believe Stephen Hawking, just before he died, the media asked him, what was there before the big bang? And his answer was nothing. Absolutely nothing, which was very interesting. And then, number 3, God created everything. Can you explain these 3 options or any others?
Yeah, well, look, Mick, that's a very tricky question, actually, and thanks to the listeners who send in these questions, Mick. We really appreciate getting them because they challenge me. And hopefully they're questions that we can really give an answer to here on air. But look, the Big Bang obviously was the middle one of those questions, but and that's probably the most popular at the moment. But the Big Bang is really the most recent. The other 2 ideas have been around forever. That is that the Earth and the planets and the universe has always been there, or that God had created it. And if you think about it, every culture in the ancient world was a very, very religious culture. Mm-hmm. They all had a theory that a god or gods had created the world. The Romans, for example, believed that the emperor actually joined in and became one of those gods. And of course, we know what the Egyptian belief in the afterlife was. They went to extraordinary lengths to mummify their bodies and give them all the food and other ancillary things to travel in the afterlife. It really was only the Jews who believed in just one all-powerful creator God. And if you think about the debates that we read in Greek philosophy, people like Plato and Aristotle, they were all believers in creation. But there were plenty of others who lived about the same time who were atheists, and they were known as the materialists. And they actually had to be quite careful because there were laws against blasphemy punishable by death, even there in the ancient world. And the most famous example of that was Socrates, because he was speaking against the gods of the state, and he was charged with blasphemy, and he was condemned to death. And of course, Socrates very famously took his punishment like a man, and there in the midst of the whole assembly, he drank the poison and died. So, there was certainly this belief in creation in the ancient world. Yeah. But how can we counter that idea that some people have put forward that the universe has always been there? I mean, that's a very interesting one, isn't it? And I think the only thing we can derive, really, the only answer we can give is look at observation and experimentation, the sort of things that science goes on with, and looking at the laws of chemistry, physics, and mathematics. And when we do look at the universe, we see this incredible amount of order. I mean, the stars and the planets all revolve around the sun. We see the same night sky at the same time of the year. There's so much order in the universe that you could, in fact, believe that it has always been there and has always been so. But if that were the case, if it had always been so, you'd expect it to always be so there in the future. So we'll come back and we'll explore that theme.
Absolutely, yeah. I would have just thought the suns would have burnt themselves out. I mean, we've already proven that, when suns, start to burn themselves out, they go supernova and, slowly that energy just burns away. So sounds like an interesting theory. It's always been there. It is 17 minutes past 8. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International, and we'll be back shortly. Yes, it's 20 minutes past 8. That was We Are Messengers with Power. You're on 94.9 this morning. We've got Dr. John on the line. He's been talking to us about a question that came in last week in regards to, I guess, the three most common or three very common reasons why we're here and the planets are here. One of them being the planets and stars were always there. The other one, there was a big bang. And the other one, God created everything. And we've been talking about the planets and stars were always there. Well, my thoughts, Dr. John, were that why didn't they burn out? Well, is that sort of a reasonable theory?
Yeah, absolutely, Mick. In fact, that's the best argument against it being there forever. Because if it had been there forever, you would expect it to go on to the future forever. But you wouldn't expect to see it breaking down. Yeah. And you mentioned supernovae, and you mentioned the sun burning itself out, and we see the debris from the comets, where the Earth has just passed through the debris from Halley's Comet. So, what we see is the world actually breaking down. And that's probably the best argument against it being always there. Mm. But the other one, of course, is the Big Bang. And the Big Bang's the most recent. It's only been around for about 50 years or so.
And I think it's the most preposterous of them all. It seems crazy that everything came from nothing.
Well, that's true. And, of course, the Big Bang really has been formulated because science can see that the world is breaking down. So the idea of it being there forever can't possibly be right. So science has come up with the Big Bang really because it doesn't want to acknowledge the existence of God. But it isn't really an explanation because it doesn't explain where the material that exploded came from. And you mentioned Stephen Hawking before, and Stephen Hawking very famously said that before the Big Bang there was nothing. And how can you have nothing and then it exploded?
Yeah, I've never done a chemistry experiment where you pour nothing into a beaker and something happens.
That's absolutely correct. The Big Bang really does defy the laws of physics because matter tends to attract. I mean, that's why we can walk on the Earth, because of gravity. That's why the moon and the stars and the planets are there. It's all because of gravity, because things attract. They don't tend to fly apart like the Big Bang would demand. And also, of course, it has to, in its inflationary period, it has to exceed the speed of light. And, of course, as far as the world is concerned, you can't exceed the speed of light. So the Big Bang has to defy the laws of physics. And anyone interested in exploring it further would find a lot of articles on the Creation Ministries website about where it came from. But I think the best explanation or the best idea of how we can say that there was a creator God is actually the existence of life. Because you really have to explain not just where the world came from, but where life came from. And, now we have Darwin's supposed explanation, but before Darwin, people believed in what they called spontaneous generation. They recognised that if you left a pile of rubbish out there in a corner, eventually it grew mice or rats. So they decided that was spontaneous generation. If you left a lump of meat out in the sun, it grew maggots. So that was spontaneous generation. And, I mean, we have to realise that it's less than 200 years ago when Louis Pasteur disproved that. That was only in about 1850 that Pasteur proved that life only comes from life. Before that, they believed that life could spontaneously generate. But, then we had Darwin a bit after Pasteur, and Darwin proposed that life really could have self-generated, chemicals could actually have turned into living things. But the problem is history hasn't really been kind to Darwin in that idea of evolution, because he didn't know anything about genetics, he didn't know anything about DNA, and evolutionary believers really are on the back foot trying to defend a concept that modern biology really shows is just impossible. They don't want to admit that there might be a creator God.
Absolutely. You are on 94.9 with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. It's 26 minutes past 8. We'll be back with Dr. John soon, 4-9. And we're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. And Dr. John's been answering a question that we had sent through, asking us to talk about the three major options for the beginning of the universe. Either the planets and stars were always there, and we spoke about how, well, if they're always there, and we know that they do burn out over time, they couldn't have always been there. And then number two was, of course, there was a Big Bang. And as Stephen Hawking said, right before the Big Bang, there was nothing, absolutely nothing. Well, it's a fairly, impossible situation. And then number three, God created everything. And Dr. John's been speaking to us about that. And Dr. John, of course, life, we're here. And I don't think I came from nothing.
No, and you're quite right, Mick. And life is the biggest problem for secular science, and Darwin came up with the idea that maybe it spontaneously generated, but time hasn't been kind to Darwin, because we now know what really is the basis of life, and it's DNA. He didn't know anything about DNA, but DNA is an information system. And information systems can't arise spontaneously. I mean, DNA is just not chemicals and atoms. It's an information code. And the interesting thing about an information code is that not only do you need to transmit the code, you have to have a decoder to interpret the code. So it really is a very, very sophisticated system. I mean, if I speak to you in a foreign language like French or German, and you don't know French or German, then the sounds that I'm transmitting don't mean anything to you, because you're not the decoder. So that's why DNA is such an amazing thing. And all living systems depend on it. Even the simplest living organisms like bacteria have got a massive amount of DNA in them. So really, you cannot get a program like that without an intelligent programmer. And the further we go on with what we know about DNA, the more impossible it seems that life could have arisen spontaneously. Even the things that evolutionists pointed to, like what we might call homology, how lots of living creatures have got the same sort of structures. You have a look at the hand of a frog, it looks a bit like a human hand. All the animals and man have got 4 limbs. And when you look at the bones in those limbs, they've got the same sort of bones in them. So it wasn't impossible for people to think, well, maybe they did come from the same ancestor. But when you actually have a look at the genetics, that throws that all on its head, because the same you would expect if we all came from the same ancestor, that the same genes would produce the same sort of limbs and hands and so on. But when you look at it, it's completely jumbled. It's quite different. And everything really is unique in the way it is structured and the way it develops. So looking at similar things and saying they must have come from a common ancestor just doesn't hold up when you have a look at the genetics involved. So really, I think the scientific evidence, when you look at it, it absolutely demands a creator God. You can't have anything but that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think we've answered that question, that of the three possibilities, the universe always being there, the Big Bang, or creation, the scientific evidence demands that it must be a creation.
And of course, things looking a little bit similar, well, it was the same creator, not necessarily the same thing that created it all. It was the same creator, which...
and he didn't have to reinvent the wheel every time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, to see three-dimensionally, we have two eyes. There's not a lot of Cyclops on the planet. Absolutely. You're on 94.9 this morning. It is 19 minutes to 9. We've been speaking with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International, and we'll be back shortly. Creation Ministries International, he's been answering your questions. If you have any questions, simply send them through to our text line, SMS 0401 949 949. And thank you for that last one, Dr. John. Very interesting. Our next question came again last week. It said, thanks, Dr. John, for explaining from the Bible and some science over the last few weeks about the age of the Earth. Are there any physical evidences at all that the Earth is young?
Yeah, well, look, that's a great question of Mick. And, of course, there are stacks of evidences that really do show that the Earth must be young. And I think the best way to start answering that question is to just look at where the millions of years ideas came from. And really the millions of years people have backed themselves into a bit of a corner, because that idea has only been around for a couple of hundred years, and it was started by a couple of guys called James Hutton and Charles Lyell. And Lyell's ideas of the millions of years were what gave Darwin his start in formulating evolution. But they said that when you look at the evidence on Earth, what you can see is that it all looks to be very, very slow, gradual, steady processes. And they decided that what they said was the present is the key to the past. They wouldn't allow for anything catastrophic to have occurred, because what we see now is slow and steady processes, and they said that's been going on like that forever. But when you have a look at it, what you see is evidence for catastrophe, and it's evidence that we really have to look at. And so when we examine things like the universe, that's really too vast to get any evidence from. So we've got to look a little bit closer to home, and we've been looking for years at our own solar system. We've been sending up space probes to try and get evidence for what's going on. And it's not easy to do that, because space probes like Voyager, they're travelling for years and years and years, sending back information, and they don't even get out of our solar system. So it's a pretty long process. But what evidences are there that actually show that the Earth is young? Well, we've mentioned many times the stories about short period comets like Halley's that everybody agrees have got a finite lifespan of less than, say, 10,000 years, which would suggest that our solar system is young. Yeah. Well, the world comes up with an explanation that says, no, they must have come from either outer space or outside our solar system, somewhere that we can't see. Well, no, you can't see it because it isn't there. And comets are a testimony to a young Earth. Now, when you look at some of the young planets, or the smaller planets like Mercury, or the moons of some of the larger planets, they all seem to have strong magnetic fields. Now, if it's a small entity like Mercury or a small moon, then over a great period of time, their magnetic fields should have diminished. They should have lost them. But in actual fact, they haven't. So that's another piece of evidence that you can say means that they're probably very young. Mm-hmm. If we look at the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, you would expect, if they've been there for billions of years, that there wouldn't be any geological activity on them. They would have burnt themselves out because they're so small. But when you look at them, there's heaps and heaps of geological activity. There's geysers that they think might be made of methane. All of this sort of action that goes on with those very, very small moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Now, that's no surprise to us if we believe that they're only a matter of thousands of years old. Mm-hmm. When we look at a lot of other geological things like the Blue Mountains and Grand Canyon and so on, we can see that they really have to have been carved catastrophically. You can't look at the small river running down the bottom and see that and think that is what's carved Grand Canyon, for example, because of the existence of things like water gaps. You know, you can't start at the top of a mountain and gradually erode through it. You know, water just doesn't work that way. Mm. But one of the greatest evidences we've got, Mick, is a local one. Now, you've only got to go up the New England Highway a few k's, and a bit north of Scone, you come to Mount Wingham, mm-hmm. Burning Mountain. Now, Burning Mountain really is something that everybody on the Central Coast can go and have a look at for themselves. It's only a couple of 100 k's up the road. And nobody really knows how it might have started. It's been there for a very long time. The Aboriginal people were very well aware of Burning Mountain. But how did it start? What it is a coal seam that's been combusting there for years and years and years and years. And mm-hmm. you can see where it began, and you can see where it is now. Now, the secular world believes that maybe it started by either a lightning strike, which is unlikely, or some volcanic lava intruded into the ground and set off the combustion. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is that the only lava stream around that has actually been dated comes out at about 40 million years. But when you have a look at Burning Mountain, it's burning at about a metre a year, and it's about 6 kilometres long. So the maximum age for it is about 6,000 years. Mm-hmm. So what does that tell you? That tells you that you really can't trust radioactive dating, because you have this conflict of something that's been going on obviously for only a matter of thousands of years, and something that's been radioactively dated at 40 million years. So there's a clear conflict there. So Burning Mountain is a local example of how the Earth really is very, very young.
Mm-hmm. You said something about how the water couldn't go through a mountain. What did you call that again?
They're called water gaps.
Water gaps, is that where, for instance, if there was a whole lot of water built up behind the mountain, it would have found another way out rather than that path?
That's right, yeah. And we see those water gaps, so the water must have found another way, so it couldn't have eroded from the top down.
Yeah,
that's what a water gap really means. So really, it's very, very interesting. But that's a perfect. Burning Mountain's a perfect local example of a young Earth. But there are plenty of others. You know, you can think of things from paleontology and biology, and we can come back and talk about that in just a moment.
All righty, you're on 94.9 this morning. It is 7 minutes to 9. Good morning. 94.9, and we're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. He's had a few interesting questions from you over the last week, and of course, send your questions through. We're waiting for them. I'll send them through to Dr. John. He can talk about them next week. And in fact, we might even have to finish off this question that came in from Anthony in Wyoming in regards to evidences, physical evidences that the Earth is young. We might finish that one next week as well. But Dr. John, that was, there's been some very interesting questions there.
Yes, look, it's all very interesting, and we're very grateful for our listeners sending them in. But the takeaway message from it all, I suppose, is that the Bible really does give us the true history of the earth. It talks about creation, the fall into sin, Noah's flood as the judgment on that first world, and then the unfolding of God's redemptive plan for people through the Jewish people. And as we know, their promised Messiah arrived in the person of Jesus. Sin was dealt with through his death on the cross. And forgiveness and eternal salvation are promised to those who put their trust in his life, his death, and his resurrection, all of which was done on their behalf. Mm-hmm. So when we know that the Bible's true, that we've accepted Jesus and put our faith and trust in him, we know that we have an explanation for where we came from and a greater explanation as to where we're going to.
Absolutely. I know where I'm going. And, look, very interesting, Dr. John. Love it. And, of course, that text line to send your questions in is 0401 949 949. SMS those questions through to us, and, of course, I send them through to Dr. John so as he can speak about them. We will speak about, we'll probably finish that one next week, and I'm pretty sure there'll probably be some more. And, of course, we try to talk about news events as well, Dr. John. We haven't had much time to do that this morning, but stuff that comes out in the news over the past week as well. If you see anything cool and you think we should talk about it, let us know. Just send a text through to that same number, 0401 949 949. Dr. John, thank you so much for coming back this week.
Yeah, thanks, Mick, and we'll see you again next week.
We'll see you next Tuesday. You're on 94.9 this morning. It is 1 minute to 9. News and weather.